On September 18, 1979, at approximately 7:42 in the morning, Thomas Brennan pulled his work van into the driveway of 847 Mockingbird Lane in McLean, Virginia, carrying tools and materials that would lead him to discover something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the world around him. He was 34 years old, divorced for 2 years, and the owner of a small contracting business that specialized in basement renovations and foundation work throughout Northern Virginia. The job at the Harmon residence was supposed to be straightforward: a 3-week project to finish an unfinished basement, install proper flooring, add recessed lighting, and create a usable family room space. The kind of work Thomas had done dozens of times before in neighborhoods exactly like this one, where 2-story colonials sat on quarter-acre lots, and families knew each other's names and children played in cul-de-sacs until the streetlights came on. The Harmons had lived at 847 Mockingbird Lane for 6 years, having moved to McLean in the spring of 1973 from what they described as a previous residence in Pittsburgh. Carl Harmon was 47 years old and worked as an import-export consultant, a position that seemed to require frequent travel, but few specific details when discussed at neighborhood gatherings. Helena Harmon was 43, a part-time librarian at the McLean Community Library, and known among neighbors for her meticulously maintained garden and her involvement in the local PTA. They had 2 children, Sarah, who was 16 and a junior at McLean High School, and Michael, who was 14 and in 8th grade. According to neighbors interviewed years later, the Harmons were exactly the kind of family that defined suburban normalcy in the late 1970s. They hosted summer barbecues. They attended local council meetings. Carl coached Michael's Little League team for 2 seasons. Elena organized the neighborhood book club and baked elaborate cakes for school fundraisers. Thomas's first meeting with the Harmons occurred on September 11th, a Tuesday afternoon, when Carl and Elena had invited him to walk through the basement and discuss the scope of the project. The basement was typical of homes built in the early 1960s: concrete floor, exposed ceiling joists, cinder block walls painted white, and minimal finishing. Carl explained that they wanted to create a recreation space for the children, somewhere Sarah and Michael could spend time with friends without taking over the main living areas of the house. The budget was reasonable, the timeline flexible, and Thomas quoted them a price that afternoon, which they accepted without negotiation. What struck Thomas during that initial walkthrough, though he wouldn't think about it carefully until much later, was Elena's very specific instructions about certain areas of the basement. She pointed to the eastern wall, approximately 16 feet in length, and explained that section couldn't be disturbed because of plumbing concerns, though Thomas noticed no visible pipes or access panels that would justify such a restriction. She was equally emphatic about the northeast corner, a roughly 4 by 6 foot section that she said had structural issues from previous water damage and needed to remain untouched until they could afford to bring in a foundation specialist. Thomas began work on September 18th, and over the first 2 weeks, he fell into an easy routine with the Harmon family. He arrived each morning around 7:30, worked until 4 in the afternoon, and often saw Sarah and Michael coming home from school during his final hour of work. His own daughter, Amy, who was 9 years old and lived with his ex-wife in Arlington, had come with him to the job site twice during those early weeks, playing in the backyard with Michael while Thomas worked inside. Elena always offered Thomas coffee when he arrived, asked about Amy, and made conversation about books she was reading or events happening at the library. Carl was around less frequently due to his travel schedule, but when he was home, he would come downstairs to check on the progress and make pleasant small talk about sports or neighborhood matters. By the end of the second week, Thomas had framed out the walls for what would become the finished space, installed electrical wiring for the recessed lighting, and begun the process of preparing the concrete floor for the laminate flooring the Harmons had selected. It was on October 1st, late in the afternoon, that Thomas first noticed something unusual about the eastern wall that Elena had designated as off-limits. He was taking measurements for the remaining sections of framing and had tapped along various walls to locate studs and verify the spacing. When he tapped along the eastern wall, the sound that came back was hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud that concrete block produced when struck. Thomas stood there for several minutes, tapping different sections of the wall, and the hollow sound persisted across approximately 12 feet of the 16-foot span. He told himself it was probably an old coal chute or storage space that had been sealed during a previous renovation, common enough in homes of this vintage. But something about Elena's specific prohibition against touching that wall, combined with the hollow sound, lodged itself in his mind as he packed up his tools that evening and drove home through the early autumn darkness, wondering why a detail that small would bother him so much. On October 2nd, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Thomas was installing a support beam along the southern wall of the basement when his sledgehammer struck the eastern wall with more force than he'd intended. The impact sent a spiderweb of cracks through what he'd assumed was solid cinder block, and a section roughly 2 feet wide collapsed inward, revealing not concrete or brick behind it, but darkness. Thomas froze, hammer still raised, and stared at the opening he'd created. The wall wasn't structural at all. It was a false facade, carefully constructed to look like part of the original foundation, but behind it was empty space. He set down the hammer, pulled a flashlight from his tool belt, and directed the beam through the opening. What the light revealed made his hands start shaking in a way they hadn't since his last months in Vietnam 6 years earlier. The hidden room was approximately 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep, accessible through what Thomas now realized was a concealed panel system that had been disguised to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wall. Inside, arranged on a workbench along the far wall, was radio equipment, several devices with dials and frequency indicators that Thomas recognized from his time as a signals intelligence specialist in the Army. There was photography equipment, a developing station with chemical baths still containing liquid, and an enlarger mounted on a stand. Filing boxes were stacked against one wall, and when Thomas directed his flashlight toward them, he could see the edges of documents and photographs protruding from manila folders. On a smaller table sat what appeared to be coding materials, sheets of paper covered in columns of numbers, and several books that looked like cipher references. The air in the room smelled faintly of chemicals and paper, and there was a quality of recent use to everything, as if someone had been working in this space within the past few days. Thomas's first instinct was to back away immediately, to repair the wall and pretend he'd seen nothing. His second instinct, the one that came from 3 years of military intelligence training, was to document everything before the evidence could be moved or destroyed. He stood in the basement for nearly 10 minutes, heart pounding, trying to process what he was looking at and what it meant. The equipment wasn't hobbyist radio gear. It was professional communications equipment, the kind used for long-range encrypted transmissions. The photography setup wasn't for family pictures. It was designed for document reproduction, for creating copies of materials that needed to be reduced in size or transmitted through covert channels. Thomas had seen setups like this before, in classified briefings about Soviet intelligence operations, in training sessions about how foreign operatives established safe houses and communication hubs in American cities. He spent the next 3 hours carefully repairing the wall, mixing fresh mortar and replacing the damaged section with materials that would match the surrounding facade. He worked methodically, making sure that when he finished, there would be no visible evidence that the wall had been breached. His hands trembled the entire time, and twice he had to stop because he thought he heard footsteps on the stairs, though both times it was only the house settling or sounds from the street outside. When Elena came home at 5:30, bringing groceries in through the side door, Thomas was working on the opposite end of the basement, installing electrical boxes, and she called down to ask if he wanted coffee. He forced his voice to sound normal, declined the coffee, and told her the work was progressing well and he'd see her tomorrow morning. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in his apartment in Arlington, staring at the ceiling, replaying what he'd seen and trying to convince himself there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps Carl's import-export business required specialized communications equipment. Perhaps the photography setup was for a hobby Elena had never mentioned. Perhaps the coding materials were related to some kind of academic research or puzzle-solving interest. But every explanation he constructed collapsed under the weight of what his training told him he'd actually discovered. By 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd made the decision to research what he'd seen, to verify his suspicions before taking any action that couldn't be undone. Over the next 3 days, Thomas spent his lunch breaks at the Arlington Public Library, looking through technical manuals and declassified military publications that discussed Soviet intelligence operations. He found descriptions of illegal networks, deep cover operatives who lived under false identities in Western countries, maintaining safe houses and communication stations that served as hubs for espionage activities. The equipment he'd seen in the Harmon basement matched the descriptions almost exactly. On October 6th, Thomas returned to work at the Harmon house, and for the first time since he'd started the project, he watched the family with new awareness. He noticed how Carl's business trips followed a regular pattern, every 2 weeks, always lasting exactly 3 days, always with vague explanations about clients and meetings that never included specific names or locations. He noticed how Elena became visibly nervous whenever he worked near the eastern wall, finding excuses to come downstairs and check on his progress, asking questions about his timeline and when he expected to move to different sections of the basement. On October 9th, Thomas's daughter Amy came with him to the job site after school, and she spent an hour playing board games with Sarah in the living room while Thomas worked below. He could hear their laughter through the floor joists, could hear Sarah helping Amy with a difficult puzzle, could hear the easy companionship of 2 children who'd become friends over the past few weeks. When Carl came home that evening and Sarah introduced Amy as her new friend, Carl was warm and friendly, asking Amy about school and telling her she was welcome to visit any time. Thomas watched this interaction and felt physically ill, because he understood with increasing certainty that he was watching people who were living elaborate lies, and that whatever action he took next would destroy not just Carl and Elena, but Sarah and Michael as well. By October 15th, Thomas had filled a small notebook with observations, dates when Carl traveled, times when the basement was accessed late at night when the family thought he'd left for the day, patterns in Elena's behavior that suggested coordination with external schedules. He knew he needed to go to the FBI, that what he'd discovered represented a genuine threat to national security, that his duty as a citizen and as a former intelligence specialist required him to report what he'd found. But he also knew that reporting the Harmons meant destroying 2 teenagers who, as far as he could tell, had no idea their parents were Soviet operatives, who believed they were living normal American lives in a normal American suburb. The impossible mathematics of the situation kept him awake night after night, weighing obligations against consequences, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. On the evening of October 15th, Thomas made his decision. He would document everything in the hidden room, photograph every piece of evidence he could access, and then he would take that evidence to the FBI with a single condition that they do everything possible to protect Sarah and Michael from the consequences of their parents' crimes. On October 16th, Thomas returned to the Harmon house with a plan that required him to become something he'd never wanted to be: a liar and a spy operating within the lives of people who trusted him. He told Elena that morning that he'd noticed some concerning cracks in the foundation along the eastern wall, small fissures that suggested settling or water infiltration that could worsen over time if not monitored. He explained that he'd need to inspect that section periodically over the next few weeks, checking to see if the cracks were expanding or if moisture was accumulating behind the walls. Elena's face tightened when he mentioned the eastern wall, but she nodded and said she understood. That, of course, he should do whatever was necessary to ensure the structural integrity of the house. Thomas hated how easily the lie came, how smoothly he delivered the false concern, how Elena believed him because she had no reason not to. Over the next 4 weeks, Thomas created opportunities to access the hidden room, always when the house was empty or when the family was occupied upstairs. He brought a small camera, a Minolta he'd bought used from a pawn shop in Arlington, and he systematically photographed everything he could reach without disturbing the arrangement of materials. The filing boxes contained documents that appeared to be photocopies of classified materials, reports with stamps marked secret and confidential, technical diagrams of military equipment, and diplomatic cables with routing information that indicated they'd originated from secure government facilities. There were schedules written in what looked like code, columns of numbers paired with dates and times that suggested coordination with external contacts. There were photographs of other documents, reduced in size to fit multiple pages onto single sheets of film, a technique Thomas recognized from intelligence work as a method for concealing large volumes of information in small, easily transportable packages. He found a logbook, handwritten entries that tracked dates, and brief notations that meant nothing to Thomas, but would likely mean everything to trained counterintelligence analysts. The handwriting varied, suggesting at least 3 different people had made entries over the past 18 months. Some entries were in English, others in what appeared to be Russian, and a few contained symbols or abbreviations Thomas couldn't decipher. What became clear through careful observation of the room's contents was that this wasn't just a storage space. It was an active operational hub, a location where multiple people came to send communications, develop photographs, and coordinate activities that required the kind of security and secrecy that only espionage operations demanded. On October 24th, Thomas took the risk of following Carl when he left for one of his regular business trips. Carl departed the house at 6:15 in the morning, driving a blue Chevrolet sedan, and Thomas stayed 3 cars back, maintaining distance while keeping the vehicle in sight. Carl didn't go to the airport or to any office building. Instead, he drove to a park in Arlington, a small recreational area along the Potomac River with walking trails and picnic areas. Thomas parked in a lot across the street and watched through binoculars as Carl walked to a specific bench overlooking the water, sat down for exactly 8 minutes, appeared to read a newspaper, and then left the newspaper on the bench when he stood up and walked back to his car. 3 minutes after Carl departed, another man, younger and wearing a dark jacket, approached the bench, picked up the newspaper, and walked in the opposite direction. Thomas had just witnessed what military intelligence training had taught him to recognize as a dead drop, a covert method of passing information without direct contact between operatives. The weight of what Thomas knew began affecting every aspect of his life in ways he couldn't control or conceal. He stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours each night, lying awake in his apartment, calculating the consequences of what he was about to do. His appetite disappeared, and he lost nearly 10 pounds over the course of 3 weeks, his clothes hanging looser, his face taking on a gaunt quality that his ex-wife noticed when he picked up Amy for a weekend visit. His daughter asked if he was sick, and he told her he was just tired from work, which was true but inadequate as an explanation for the exhaustion that went far deeper than physical fatigue. On November 10th, something happened that made Thomas's situation exponentially more complicated. He was packing up his tools at the end of the workday when Elena came downstairs carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and sat down on the stairs, and she told him she'd noticed he seemed stressed lately, that he looked like he wasn't sleeping well, and she wanted him to know that if he needed to talk about anything, personal problems or work concerns or whatever was weighing on him, she was a good listener. The kindness in her voice was genuine. The concern in her eyes was real, and Thomas understood in that moment that whatever else Elena was, whatever lies she lived and whatever crimes she committed, her capacity for human compassion hadn't been entirely consumed by her double life. He thanked her, said he was fine, just dealing with some custody issues with his ex-wife, which was a lie but one she accepted with sympathetic understanding. That evening, Thomas sat in his apartment and confronted the full complexity of what he was facing. Elena's kindness hadn't been manipulated. It had been an authentic human connection, which meant that somewhere beneath the cover identity and the espionage work, there was a person who cared about others, who noticed when someone was struggling, who offered comfort. But that same person was also facilitating the theft of American military secrets, was participating in an operation that potentially put American lives at risk, and was raising children in a foundation built entirely on deception. Thomas realized there was no version of this situation where everyone emerged unharmed, no choice he could make that wouldn't destroy lives, no solution that would feel anything other than a betrayal of someone. By November 20th, Thomas had documented everything he could safely access in the hidden room. He had photographs of schedules, communications equipment, coding materials, and copies of classified documents. He had his own written observations about Carl's patterns and the dead drop he'd witnessed. He had enough evidence to prove beyond any doubt that the Harmons were operating a Soviet intelligence safe house, and that the scope of their operation extended beyond just the 2 of them to include at least several other operatives in the Washington area. That evening, Thomas made the phone call that would set everything else in motion. He contacted the FBI Washington field office and asked to speak to someone in counterintelligence. When the duty officer asked what the call was regarding, Thomas took a breath and said he had information about a Soviet espionage operation. Then he added one more thing, a condition that he knew might be impossible, but that he had to request anyway. He said that when they took action, they needed to do everything in their power to protect 2 children who were innocent victims of their parents' crimes. On November 21st, at 6:15 in the evening, Thomas walked through the doors of the FBI Washington field office carrying a manila envelope containing 43 photographs and 7 pages of handwritten observations that would provide the Bureau with everything they needed to dismantle a Soviet intelligence network that had been operating successfully in Northern Virginia for at least 4 years and possibly longer. He waited in the lobby for 47 minutes, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair under fluorescent lighting that made everything look pale and institutional, before a man in his early 40s approached and introduced himself as Special Agent David Kowalski from the Counterintelligence Division. Kowalski led Thomas to a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor, and for the next 3 hours, Thomas explained how he'd discovered the hidden room, what he'd found inside, and what he'd observed about the Harmon family's patterns and behaviors over the past 2 months. Kowalski listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook, and when Thomas finished, the agent was quiet for nearly a minute before speaking. He told Thomas that the FBI had been aware since late 1977 that there was a Soviet illegal network operating somewhere in the Washington metropolitan area, that they'd identified patterns in leaked classified information that suggested a sophisticated collection operation with multiple access points into defense and intelligence agencies. But they hadn't been able to identify the hub of the network, the location where operatives met and coordinated their activities. Thomas's discovery had just handed them the breakthrough they'd been searching for, and Kowalski's assessment, delivered in the flat, professional tone of someone who dealt with espionage cases regularly, was that the Harmons were almost certainly not who they claimed to be. Their real names were probably Russian. Their entire background story about Pittsburgh and Carl's import-export business was likely fabricated, and the identities they were living under had been carefully constructed by Soviet intelligence services before they ever entered the United States. Kowalski explained that operatives like the Harmons were called illegals in intelligence terminology, agents who lived under deep cover for years or even decades, establishing themselves in communities, building relationships, and creating lives that appeared completely ordinary while serving as infrastructure for espionage operations. The children, Kowalski said, presented a complication that the Bureau would need to handle carefully, because Sarah and Michael were almost certainly genuine family members, likely born in the United States or brought here at such a young age that they had no memory of any other life, and they were almost certainly unaware of their parents' true identities and activities. Thomas asked what would happen to Sarah and Michael when arrests were made, and Kowalski's answer was honest, but not comforting. The children would be placed in protective custody initially, then likely turned over to Soviet diplomatic personnel, since they were technically Soviet citizens even if they'd been born on American soil and had lived their entire lives believing they were American. The alternative, allowing them to remain in the United States, would require them to essentially orphan themselves, to denounce their parents and cooperate with authorities in ways that teenagers couldn't reasonably be expected to do. Thomas felt something break inside him when he heard this, understanding that his decision to report what he'd found meant Sarah and Michael would lose everything: their home, their friends, their identities, and quite possibly their faith in every relationship and memory they'd ever trusted. The plan that emerged from that meeting was for Thomas to continue his renovation work as if nothing had changed, while FBI surveillance teams established monitoring positions around the Harmon house and began tracking Carl and Elena's movements. The goal was to observe the network in operation, to identify as many operatives as possible before making arrests, to build a comprehensive case that would allow prosecutors to charge everyone involved and potentially negotiate exchanges for American intelligence officers held by the Soviets. Thomas would be wired with a recording device during his work hours, and FBI technicians would install listening equipment and cameras in locations throughout the basement, where they could monitor activity in the hidden room without alerting the Harmons to the surveillance. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas returned to work at 847 Mockingbird Lane each morning, knowing that everything he said and did was being monitored and recorded by federal agents positioned in a surveillance van 2 blocks away. The stress of maintaining his cover, of acting normally while knowing he was functioning as bait in a counterintelligence operation, manifested in ways Thomas couldn't fully control. His hand shook when he held tools. He found himself forgetting conversations moments after they occurred. He snapped at Amy during a weekend visit, then apologized immediately, unable to explain why he was so on edge. The only thing that kept him functional was the understanding that stopping now, backing away from what he'd set in motion, would accomplish nothing except leaving a Soviet intelligence network operating freely in American suburbs. On December 5th, FBI surveillance captured evidence of 2 other operatives using the hidden room in the Harmon basement. Both entered through the main floor while the family was away, accessed the concealed panel through a method that suggested they'd been trained in its operation, and spent approximately 30 minutes in the room before leaving separately. One was a woman in her late 30s who drove a vehicle registered to an address in Alexandria. The other was a man in his 50s whose license plate traced back to a consulting firm in Bethesda. Both individuals became subjects of additional FBI investigation, and within a week, agents had identified their likely cover identities and employment positions, both of which provided access to classified government facilities. On December 12th, Thomas was finishing his work on the basement renovation, the project finally nearing completion after 3 months. Elena came downstairs that afternoon carrying a plate of cookies she'd baked, chocolate chip still warm, and she thanked him for his patience with what she acknowledged had been a complicated project with unexpected delays and restrictions. She told him that he'd done beautiful work, that the basement had been transformed into exactly the kind of space they'd hoped for, and that she was grateful he'd been so professional and understanding throughout the process. Thomas accepted the cookies, thanked her, and watched her walk back upstairs, and something inside him fractured completely in that moment, because her gratitude was genuine and her kindness was real, and he knew that within a week she would be under arrest and her children's lives would be destroyed. And she had no idea that the contractor she'd trusted had been the one to set it all in motion. On December 18th, Kowalski called Thomas and informed him that the Bureau had gathered sufficient evidence and identified enough operatives in the network to proceed with coordinated arrests. The operation was scheduled for December 20th, early morning, and Thomas was instructed not to return to the Harmon house after December 19th, that his work was considered complete, and that his identity as the source of the investigation would remain classified to protect him from potential retaliation. On December 20th, 1979, at 6:47 in the morning, FBI agents executed coordinated arrests at 3 locations across Northern Virginia, dismantling in a single operation what counterintelligence analysts would later describe as one of the most sophisticated Soviet illegal networks operating on American soil during the Cold War era. Thomas was not present at any of the arrest sites, having been specifically instructed by Agent Kowalski to remain at his apartment and await contact once the operations were complete. He sat in his living room from 6 until nearly 11, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, staring at the phone, and imagining what was happening at 847 Mockingbird Lane while he waited in enforced distance from the consequences of his choices. The details came to Thomas in fragments over the following days, through phone calls with Kowalski, and through carefully worded news reports that began appearing in the Washington Post on December 21st. Carl and Elena Harmon had been arrested without incident, taken into custody as they prepared breakfast in their kitchen, federal agents entering through the front door with a warrant that had been sealed until the moment of execution. The children, Sarah and Michael, had been asleep upstairs when the arrests occurred, and had been woken by FBI personnel who explained with as much gentleness as the situation allowed that their parents were being detained on federal charges and that the children would need to come with agents to a secure location where their safety could be ensured and their situation could be properly evaluated. What Thomas learned later, through Kowalski's careful debriefing sessions, was that Carl and Elena were not the names these people had been born with, that their real identities were Konstantin Dmitrievich Sokolov and Irina Mikhailovna Petrova, both Soviet citizens who had been recruited by the KGB in the early 1960s and trained as illegal operatives at a facility outside Moscow that specialized in creating deep cover agents. They had been married in 1960, had undergone years of training in American culture, language, and tradecraft, and had been inserted into the United States in 1965 with completely fabricated identities, forged documents that identified them as American citizens born in the Midwest, and a cover story that had been constructed with enough detail and supporting evidence to withstand casual investigation. They had lived in various cities under different names before settling in McLean in 1973, and for 6 years they had operated the safe house on Mockingbird Lane, serving as coordinators for a network of at least 5 other operatives who used the hidden room to develop film, transmit communications, and exchange intelligence materials gathered from positions within the Department of Defense, the State Department, and several defense contractors working on classified military projects. Sarah and Michael, according to records that Soviet diplomatic personnel eventually provided during negotiations over the arrests, had been born in East Germany in 1963 and 1965 respectively, before their parents' deployment to the United States, and had been brought to America as infants with forged birth certificates identifying them as natural-born citizens. They had grown up entirely within their parents' cover identity, attending American schools, making American friends, and living what they genuinely believed were normal American lives. The horror of their situation, as Kowalski explained to Thomas, was that Sarah and Michael had discovered in a single morning that everything they understood about themselves was a lie, that their names might not be their real names, that their citizenship was fraudulent, that their entire existence had been constructed to serve an espionage operation they'd known nothing about. Thomas's daughter, Amy, asked him 4 days after the arrests why Sarah hadn't been at school, why she hadn't called, why no one was answering the phone at the Harmon house. Thomas told Amy that the Harmons had moved suddenly, that Carl's work had required them to relocate without much notice, and that Sarah had probably been too busy with the move to say goodbye properly, but would likely write once they were settled in their new home. The lie made Thomas feel physically sick, but he couldn't tell his 9-year-old daughter the truth, couldn't explain that Sarah's entire life had been dismantled, that she was likely in some kind of protective custody facility being questioned by federal agents and preparing for deportation to a country she had no memory of and whose language she might not even speak. Christmas, 1979, arrived 6 days after the arrests, and Thomas spent it alone in his apartment because Amy was with her mother's family in Pennsylvania, and he couldn't bring himself to accept invitations from friends who wanted to include him in their holiday celebrations. On December 27th, he drove to the FBI field office and met with Kowalski, asking what would happen to Sarah and Michael, whether there was any possibility they could remain in the United States, whether anyone was ensuring they had support and counseling to help them process the trauma of what they were experiencing. Kowalski's answers were measured and largely unhopeful. The children were being housed in a facility in Northern Virginia under the supervision of FBI personnel and social workers. Soviet diplomatic officials had been in contact regarding their status and were negotiating for their return to the Soviet Union along with their parents as part of a broader prisoner exchange that was being discussed at levels far above Kowalski's authority. The possibility of Sarah and Michael remaining in the United States existed only if they chose to renounce their parents, cooperate fully with federal investigators, and essentially orphan themselves, cutting all ties to the only family they'd ever known. And Kowalski's assessment was that no reasonable person could expect teenagers to make that choice, nor would it be ethical to pressure them into doing so. Thomas asked if he could see them, if he could at least try to offer some kind of support or explanation, and Kowalski said no, that Thomas's identity as the source of the investigation was classified, that revealing his role could compromise other ongoing operations, and that contact between Thomas and the children would raise questions that couldn't be adequately answered without exposing information that needed to remain protected. Thomas requested that his identity remain permanently classified, that even in future declassifications or historical reviews of the case, his name not be attached to the discovery or the investigation. Kowalski said he would make that recommendation to his superiors, and that given the circumstances and Thomas's cooperation, the request would likely be granted. On January 15, 1980, formal espionage charges were filed against Konstantin Sokolov and Irina Petrova in federal court, and their arraignment was held in a partially sealed proceeding due to the classified nature of the evidence. Both pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and acting as agents of a foreign government, and both were sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Sentences that everyone involved understood were largely symbolic, given that prisoner exchange negotiations were already underway. The house at 847 Mockingbird Lane sat empty through January and February, a for sale sign eventually appearing in the front yard, and Thomas drove past it twice during those months, unable to stop himself from looking at the dark windows and the untended lawn and the basketball hoop in the driveway where Michael had practiced free throws on autumn afternoons. He thought about the basement he'd renovated, about the hidden room behind the false wall, about the 3 months he'd spent in that house building something while simultaneously destroying everything the family who lived there had constructed over years of careful deception. By March, Thomas learned through Kowalski that the exchange had been completed, that Konstantin and Irina had been traded for 2 CIA officers who had been held in Soviet prisons, and that Sarah and Michael had been sent to the Soviet Union with their parents, their American lives ending as abruptly and completely as if those lives had never existed at all. In May of 1980, Konstantin Dmitrievich Sokolov and Irina Mikhailovna Petrova, the people Thomas had known as Carl and Elena Harmon, were exchanged for 2 American intelligence officers at a border crossing between West and East Germany, and they returned to the Soviet Union along with Sarah and Michael, who were now legally classified as Soviet citizens, and whose American birth certificates had been revealed as elaborate forgeries created 16 and 14 years earlier. Thomas learned these details from a brief phone call with Agent Kowalski, who explained that the exchange had been completed successfully, and that the case, from the FBI's perspective, was closed. Thomas thanked him for the information and hung up the phone, and he sat in his apartment for a long time afterward, thinking about 2 teenagers being taken to a country they had no memory of, speaking a language they might not know, forced to build new lives in a society completely foreign to everything they'd experienced. The house at 847 Mockingbird Lane was sold in August of 1980 to a family from Maryland, a couple with 3 young children who knew nothing about what had occurred in that house beyond vague rumors they'd heard from neighbors about the previous owners being involved in some kind of legal trouble. Thomas drove past the house one afternoon in September and saw children's toys scattered across the front lawn, a swing set being assembled in the backyard, and the ordinary chaos of a family settling into a new home. The normalcy of the scene was profoundly disorienting, as if the trauma and devastation of 9 months earlier had been erased and replaced with a clean slate that bore no trace of what had been lost. Thomas continued his contracting work throughout 1980 and 1981, taking jobs in other neighborhoods, renovating other basements, but he found himself unable to work with the same ease he'd once felt. He became anxious around clients who were too friendly, suspicious of households that seemed too perfect, and haunted by the knowledge that surfaces could conceal anything. In 1982, when Amy was 12 years old, and old enough to sense when adults were lying to her, she asked again what had really happened to Sarah, why her friend had disappeared so suddenly and completely. Thomas sat her down at his kitchen table and told her a version of the truth that was closer to complete than the story he'd given her 2 years earlier. He explained that Sarah's parents had been involved in something illegal, that they'd been lying about who they were, and that Sarah and her brother had been forced to leave the country with their parents. Amy asked if Sarah had known about what her parents were doing, and Thomas said no, that Sarah had been innocent, that she'd lost everything through no fault of her own. Amy asked if Sarah was okay wherever she was now, and Thomas said he didn't know, which was the truest thing he could say. In 1985, Thomas drove past 847 Mockingbird Lane and saw the family that had bought the house in 1980 having a barbecue in their backyard. Neighbors gathered around picnic tables, children running through a sprinkler on the lawn, and the scene looked exactly like the neighborhood gatherings the Harmons had hosted during the years they'd lived there. The substitution of one normal family for another, the seamless way the suburb had absorbed the absence and moved forward, struck Thomas as both reassuring and deeply wrong, as if the trauma should have left some visible mark, some permanent scar that prevented the location from ever appearing innocent again. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began its slow collapse, Thomas watched the news coverage and wondered if Sarah and Michael were watching too, if they were old enough now, 26 and 24, to understand what their parents had been part of, whether they'd been told the truth about their childhood, or whether they'd been fed different lies in the Soviet Union to replace the American lies they'd grown up believing. He wondered if they hated their parents for what had been done to them, or if they'd found ways to forgive, or if forgiveness was even a relevant concept when the betrayal was so fundamental and total. In 1995, Thomas was contacted by a researcher from Georgetown University who was working on a Cold War history project and had obtained recently declassified FBI files about Soviet illegal networks in the Washington area. The researcher asked if Thomas would be willing to discuss his role in discovering the Harmon operation, explaining that enough time had passed and enough files had been released that Thomas's identity was no longer classified. Thomas declined the interview, saying he had nothing to add to the public record and preferred not to revisit that period of his life. The researcher thanked him and said she understood, and Thomas hung up the phone feeling grateful that he'd been given the choice to remain silent. In 2001, Thomas's daughter Amy, now 31 years old and working as a teacher in Baltimore, came to visit him for Thanksgiving. And during dinner she asked him about Sarah, a question she hadn't raised in years. She said she'd been thinking about her childhood friendship with Sarah lately, remembering how they'd played together during those weeks in 1979, and she wanted to know if her father had ever learned what happened to Sarah after she was sent to the Soviet Union. Thomas told Amy the truth, which was that he'd never received any information about Sarah or Michael after 1980, that he had no idea where they were or what their lives had become, that the only thing he knew with certainty was that their childhood had been stolen from them, and that his actions, however necessary or justified, had been the mechanism of that theft. Amy asked if he regretted what he'd done, and Thomas said he'd spent 22 years trying to answer that question, and still hadn't found an answer that satisfied him. In 2003, Thomas read an article in the Washington Post about newly released Soviet intelligence files that documented Cold War espionage operations in the United States. And buried in the article was a mention of the Harmon network, described as one of the most successful illegal operations of the 1970s, responsible for transmitting classified information about satellite reconnaissance systems, strategic weapons development, and diplomatic communications that had given Soviet military planners significant advantages in understanding American capabilities and intentions. The article confirmed that the operation had been genuinely damaging to national security, that Thomas's discovery and report had prevented further compromise of classified programs, and that the FBI considered the case a major counterintelligence success. But Thomas read those assessments and thought about Sarah's 16th birthday party, which he'd attended 2 weeks before the arrests, where he'd watched her blow out candles on a cake and make a wish while surrounded by friends who believed she was exactly who she appeared to be, and he couldn't make the abstract concepts of national security and counterintelligence success outweigh the concrete memory of a teenager's happiness on the last normal day of her life. Thomas Brennan was 58 years old in 2003, still working as a contractor, still living alone, still driving occasionally past 847 Mockingbird Lane, where yet another family had moved in, and yet another set of children played in a yard that held no visible evidence of what had occurred there 24 years earlier. He understood intellectually that he had done what was necessary, that allowing a Soviet espionage network to continue operating would have been an abdication of responsibility, that his choice had been between competing obligations with no option that didn't cause harm. But understanding something intellectually and finding peace with it were entirely different achievements, and Thomas had long since accepted that peace was not something he would ever feel about the autumn of 1979. He had made his choice, and two teenagers had paid the price for their parents' crimes, and that equation would never balance no matter how many years passed or how many justifications he constructed. The house on Mockingbird Lane would always be, for Thomas, the place where he learned that doing the right thing and doing the devastating thing could be exactly the same action, and that living with that knowledge was a burden that never became lighter, only more familiar.